There are truck stops where death comes measured in gallons, and the Lone Star State has more of them than you'd ever want to know. My name is Rafael, and I've been running freight between Mexico and the American heartland for 17 years. Born in Laredo, raised on both sides of the Rio Grande, I learned early that survival in the border regions meant understanding which people to trust, which roads to avoid, and which fuel stops might be your last. The endless highways of Texas became my domain. Interstate 35 from Laredo to Dallas, Highway 83 through the Rio Grande Valley, Interstate 10 stretching from El Paso to Houston like a concrete lifeline across 800 miles of desert, plains, and piney woods. But nothing in nearly 2 decades of border running prepared me for that September night, when I discovered that some predators don't chase their prey. They poison it slowly, methodically, turning the very fuel that powers your truck into a chemical countdown to death. Since that night, I test every drop of diesel before it enters my tank, carry chemical analysis strips like other truckers carry maps, and sleep with antidote medications that most people have never heard of. The nightmares come in waves, always the same. The gradual realization that something is wrong, the slow understanding that your own fuel system is killing you, and the race against time to find help before the poison finishes its work. I was 41 years old then, a third-generation trucker whose grandfather had hauled cotton across Texas in the 1940s and whose father had built a small fleet of trucks serving the maquiladora factories along the Mexican border. My wife Carmen had died in a car accident 5 years earlier, leaving me with nothing but the road and a reputation as one of the few drivers experienced enough to handle sensitive cross-border cargo without asking inconvenient questions. My truck was a 2019 Kenworth T680 with a custom sleeper berth that had become my mobile home, a place where I could rest between runs, cook simple meals, and maintain the solitude that grief had made necessary. The interior was sparse but functional, a narrow bunk, a small refrigerator, a microwave, and photographs of Carmen taped to the walls to remind me of what I'd lost and why I kept moving. The rig itself was equipped for long-haul border running, dual fuel tanks with a combined capacity of 300 gallons, advanced GPS tracking systems, satellite communication equipment, and enough emergency supplies to survive for days if weather or mechanical problems stranded me in remote areas. After 17 years of hauling freight through some of the most dangerous territory in North America, I'd learned that preparation and self-sufficiency were often the difference between completing a run and becoming another statistic. That particular September run started normally enough. I'd picked up a load of automotive electronics in Nuevo Laredo, computer modules, wiring harnesses, and sensor assemblies bound for a Ford assembly plant in Dearborn, Michigan. The cargo was valuable but routine, the kind of high-tech components that moved across the border daily as part of the integrated North American automotive supply chain. The paperwork was pristine, the seals were intact, and the manifest matched exactly what had been loaded into my trailer. I'd dealt with the shipper before, Industrias Montemayor, a legitimate maquiladora operation that had been producing automotive components for American manufacturers for over 15 years. Nothing about the load suggested any unusual risks or complications, but someone had been watching my routes, studying my patterns, and planning an attack that would unfold over several hundred miles with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. I crossed into the United States at the World Trade Bridge around 10 p.m., completing the customs and border protection procedures that had become routine after nearly 2 decades of cross-border hauling. The CBP officers knew me by sight, and the inspection process was expedited because of my fast card and clean record with previous shipments. By 11 p.m., I was fueling up at Rodrigo's Truck Plaza, a family-owned facility just north of Laredo that had been serving cross-border truckers since the 1980s. Rodrigo Hernandez and his sons had built a reputation for honest dealing, competitive prices, and fuel quality that met the demanding standards of professional drivers who couldn't afford mechanical problems in remote areas. I'd been stopping at Rodrigo's for over a decade, knew the family personally, and trusted their operation completely. The diesel pumps were modern and well-maintained, the fuel came from major refineries, and the storage tanks were cleaned and tested regularly according to EPA standards. But someone had compromised the fuel supply chain before it reached Rodrigo's pumps. The first hint that something was wrong came about an hour north of Laredo, as I was climbing the long grades between the Rio Grande Valley and the Edwards Plateau. My Cummins ISX engine began running slightly rough. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle irregularity in the way it responded to throttle inputs and gear changes. After 17 years of driving the same truck, I knew every sound, every vibration, every characteristic of normal operation. The Kenworth and I had covered over 2 million miles together, hauling freight through blizzards, sandstorms, and heat waves that would have killed lesser drivers. We were partners in a profession that demanded absolute trust between human and machine. What I was experiencing wasn't normal. I pulled into a rest area near Dilley, Texas, and conducted a thorough inspection. Engine oil level was fine, coolant temperature was within normal parameters, and all dashboard indicators showed green. I checked the fuel filters, examined the air intake system, and tested the electronic engine management modules. Everything appeared to be functioning normally. But the rough running persisted, and I noticed that fuel consumption had increased by about 8% over normal highway driving conditions. The engine was working harder to produce the same power output, suggesting that something was interfering with the combustion process. I radioed Rodrigo's to report the fuel quality issue, thinking that perhaps they'd received a bad batch from their supplier. Rodrigo himself answered the CB call, and his response sent the first real chill of fear down my spine. "Rafael, you're the 4th driver today to report engine problems after fueling here. We've tested our tanks 3 times. The fuel quality is perfect, but something's wrong with trucks that fueled between 10 p.m. and midnight. 4th driver." The number hit me like a physical blow. If multiple truckers were experiencing similar problems after fueling during the same time window, we weren't dealing with random fuel contamination or mechanical failures. We were dealing with sabotage. "What happened to the other 3 drivers?" I asked. The silence on the radio lasted long enough that I thought the transmission had been lost. Finally, Rodrigo's voice came back, carefully controlled, but edged with fear. 2 of them made it to repair shops in San Antonio. The 3rd one, Miguel Santos, he collapsed at a truck stop in Austin. Paramedics said it looked like some kind of poisoning. He's in the hospital now, unconscious. Poisoning. The word transformed my mechanical problem into a life-threatening emergency. Whatever was wrong with my engine was also affecting the drivers, slowly and systematically, with symptoms subtle enough that we might not recognize the danger until it was too late to save ourselves. I felt the first wave of nausea hit just as Rodrigo finished talking. Not the sudden, violent sickness of food poisoning or flu, but a gradual creeping queasiness that seemed to originate somewhere deep in my nervous system. My vision blurred slightly, and I had to grip the steering wheel to steady myself. The contaminated fuel was burning in my engine and releasing toxic compounds into the exhaust system. Some of those compounds were seeping into the cab despite the ventilation systems, slowly poisoning me with every mile I drove. I needed medical attention, and I needed it immediately, but I was still over 200 miles from major medical facilities in Dallas or Houston, on a stretch of Interstate 35 that passed through small towns and rural areas where emergency rooms might not be equipped to handle exotic poisoning cases. My hands were starting to shake as I reached for my cell phone to call 911. The tremors weren't from fear alone. They were neurological symptoms, indicating that whatever toxin was in my system was affecting my central nervous system. If the poisoning continued to progress, I might lose the ability to drive safely or even communicate my location to emergency responders. But as I tried to dial, my coordination deteriorated rapidly. The simple task of pressing numbers on the phone keypad became almost impossible as my hands shook and my vision continued to blur. When the 911 dispatcher finally answered, my speech was slurred enough that she had difficulty understanding my location and the nature of my emergency. "Sir, are you intoxicated? Do you need police or medical assistance?" "Poisoned," I managed to say, each word requiring tremendous effort. "Truck fuel, contaminated. Other drivers in hospitals." "Sir, I'm dispatching an ambulance to your location. Can you remain conscious and stay on the line?" I tried to respond, but the headache that had been building for the past hour suddenly intensified to the point where speaking was almost impossible. The pain felt like someone was driving steel spikes through my skull, while simultaneously my stomach churned with nausea that threatened to make me vomit. Through my increasingly blurred vision, I saw another truck pulling into the rest area, a late-model Peterbilt with Mexican plates and a trailer configuration similar to mine. The driver appeared to be experiencing the same symptoms I was, weaving slightly as he parked and then sitting motionless in his cab as if he didn't have the strength to get out. This wasn't random. This wasn't accidental contamination affecting a few unlucky drivers. Someone was systematically poisoning trucks carrying specific types of cargo, and they were doing it with such precision that multiple drivers were reaching critical toxic exposure levels at approximately the same geographic locations. The ambulance arrived 45 minutes later, during which time I had lapsed in and out of consciousness several times. The second driver, whose name I later learned was Carlos Mendez, was completely unconscious when the paramedics reached him. Both of us were loaded into separate ambulances and rushed to Scott and White Hospital in Temple, Texas, the nearest medical facility equipped to handle complex poisoning cases. The emergency room doctors initially treated us as drug overdose patients, assuming that we had consumed illegal substances that caused our symptoms. But when I managed to explain about the fuel contamination and the pattern of similar cases affecting multiple drivers, the medical team immediately contacted the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force and the Texas Department of Public Safety's Criminal Investigation Division. What followed was one of the most complex and far-reaching investigations in the history of domestic terrorism in Texas. Federal agents discovered that someone had been systematically contaminating diesel fuel supplies at strategic locations along Interstate 35, specifically targeting trucks carrying electronics and automotive components from Mexican manufacturing facilities. The contamination method was both sophisticated and terrifying. Instead of adding poison directly to fuel tanks, the perpetrators had introduced a chemical compound called dimethylmercury, one of the most toxic substances known to science, into the fuel distribution system serving several truck stops along the I-35 corridor. Dimethylmercury is stable in diesel fuel and doesn't significantly affect engine performance in small concentrations. But when burned in truck engines, it breaks down into mercury vapor and other organometallic compounds that are absorbed through the lungs and skin, causing severe neurological damage and eventual death. The compound had been designed specifically to produce symptoms that would develop gradually over several hundred miles of driving. The timing wasn't accidental. It was calculated to ensure that affected drivers would reach maximum toxic exposure somewhere between Austin and Dallas, creating a corridor of terror that would disrupt the North American automotive supply chain. But the investigation revealed something even more chilling. The poisoning operation was part of a larger economic warfare campaign being conducted by a sophisticated criminal organization with connections to foreign intelligence services. By systematically targeting trucks carrying automotive and electronics components, they were attempting to disrupt trade relationships between the United States and Mexico. The organization's goal wasn't just to kill individual truckers. It was to create such a climate of fear that experienced drivers would refuse to accept loads from Mexico, effectively paralyzing cross-border commerce and forcing American manufacturers to relocate their operations to other countries. Dr. Patricia Williams, the toxicologist who supervised my treatment at Scott and White, explained the full horror of what had been done to us. Dimethylmercury is one of the most insidious poisons ever created, she said. It can be absorbed through rubber gloves, it's virtually odorless and tasteless, and by the time symptoms appear, the damage is often irreversible. The mercury poisoning had affected every major organ system in my body. My liver was struggling to process the toxic compounds, my kidneys were beginning to fail, and the neurological damage was causing tremors, vision problems, and cognitive impairment that might be permanent. Carlos Mendez, the other driver who had been poisoned, was in even worse condition. He had lapsed into a coma shortly after arriving at the hospital, and doctors weren't certain he would survive. The concentration of mercury in his blood was nearly 10 times higher than mine, suggesting that his fuel had been more heavily contaminated or that he had been exposed for a longer period. The treatment protocol was intensive and painful. Chelation therapy, the process of binding mercury ions with chemical agents that could be filtered out by the kidneys, required daily intravenous infusions of substances that were almost as toxic as the mercury itself. The side effects included severe nausea, kidney damage, and neurological symptoms that often made the cure seem worse than the disease. But without treatment, Dr. Williams explained, the mercury would continue accumulating in my brain and other organs until it killed me. The chelation therapy was the only chance I had of surviving with my mental faculties intact. The FBI investigation expanded rapidly as agents realized the scope of the threat. Special Agent Maria Santos, who headed the Joint Terrorism Task Force in San Antonio, coordinated a multi-agency response that included the FBI, ATF, DEA, EPA, and Customs and Border Protection. The investigation eventually involved law enforcement agencies in 4 states and 2 countries. "What happened to you and the other drivers represents a new form of terrorism," Agent Santos explained during one of our interviews. "The perpetrators used chemical weapons against civilian infrastructure, specifically targeting the transportation systems that our economy depends on. The forensic investigation was painstakingly complex. Federal agents had to trace the contaminated fuel back through multiple distribution points, identify the specific locations where dimethylmercury had been introduced, and determine how the perpetrators had gained access to the fuel supply chain. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that someone had been bribing fuel transport drivers to introduce small quantities of dimethylmercury into their tanker trucks during loading operations at refineries. The contaminated fuel was then delivered to specific truck stops during predetermined time windows, ensuring that the poison would only affect certain types of cargo and specific drivers. But the investigation also revealed something that chilled me to the bone. The criminal organization had been conducting surveillance operations against individual truckers for months before the poisoning campaign began. They had detailed profiles of drivers like me who specialized in cross-border hauling, including information about our routes, schedules, fuel consumption patterns, and even personal habits. My name was in their files. Rafael Delgado, age 41, third-generation trucker, specializes in automotive electronics from Mexican maquiladoras, typically fuels at Rodrigo's Truck Plaza between 10 p.m. and midnight, follows consistent route patterns on Interstate 35 northbound. They had been planning to kill me specifically, along with dozens of other drivers whose expertise in cross-border hauling made us valuable targets for economic warfare. We weren't random victims. We were carefully selected casualties in a campaign designed to cripple North American trade relationships. The psychological impact of that knowledge was almost worse than the physical effects of mercury poisoning. For months, I thought I was just another unlucky trucker who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Learning that I'd been stalked, studied, and specifically targeted for assassination made every aspect of daily life feel threatening and dangerous. The investigation eventually led to arrests in Texas, California, and Mexico, but Agent Santos warned me that the network was larger and more sophisticated than the individuals who had been captured. "This organization has been operating for years," she said. "They have resources, intelligence capabilities, and access to chemical weapons that rival some foreign governments." The trials that followed were complex and highly publicized. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were simply fuel transport workers who had been manipulated by unknown third parties. They claimed that the real masterminds of the poisoning campaign were foreign agents who had disappeared back to their home countries before arrests could be made. But the evidence was overwhelming. Wiretapped phone conversations, financial records, and surveillance footage proved that the defendants had been willing participants in a conspiracy to commit mass murder using chemical weapons. The jury convicted all 7 defendants on terrorism charges, with sentences ranging from life in prison without parole to death. However, the convictions didn't end my nightmare. The organization's network was international in scope, with cells operating in multiple countries and connections to intelligence services that viewed economic warfare as a legitimate tool of national policy. Federal prosecutors warned me that I might remain a target for retaliation from organization members who had escaped capture. My recovery from mercury poisoning took over 2 years and required ongoing medical treatment that consumed most of my savings and insurance coverage. The chelation therapy was eventually successful in reducing the mercury levels in my blood, but the neurological damage was permanent. I would never again have the reflexes, coordination, and mental acuity that professional trucking required. Dr. Williams was blunt about the long-term prognosis. "You're alive, which is more than we expected when you arrived at the emergency room," she said. "But you'll need ongoing medical monitoring for the rest of your life. Mercury poisoning can cause delayed effects that don't appear for years after exposure." The physical disabilities forced me to retire from trucking, ending a career that had defined my identity for nearly 2 decades. Workers' compensation and federal victim assistance programs provided some financial support, but they couldn't restore the sense of purpose and independence that the road had given me. But the experience also opened new opportunities that I never would have considered before the poisoning. My survival of chemical weapons terrorism made me a valuable consultant for law enforcement agencies investigating similar threats. My technical knowledge of trucking operations and cross-border commerce provided insights that helped federal agents understand vulnerabilities in transportation infrastructure. I began working with the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Task Force, providing expertise about truck stop security, fuel distribution systems, and the methods that criminal organizations might use to attack transportation networks. The work was meaningful and well compensated, but it also required me to relive the trauma of my poisoning experience repeatedly. The consulting work led to speaking engagements at trucking industry conferences, law enforcement training seminars, and congressional hearings about transportation security threats. My message was always the same. Economic warfare is real. Chemical weapons attacks against civilian infrastructure are increasing, and the trucking industry needs sophisticated countermeasures to survive in the current threat environment. But I also emphasized that attacks could be prevented and survived if drivers and companies implemented appropriate security procedures. The fuel poisoning had nearly killed me, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about threat recognition, chemical testing protocols, and the importance of rapid medical intervention when poisoning occurred. The presentations resonated with audiences who were beginning to understand that trucking had become a front line in various forms of economic and political warfare. Foreign intelligence services, organized crime syndicates, terrorist organizations, and domestic extremist groups all viewed transportation infrastructure as a vulnerable target for achieving strategic objectives. But many trucking companies were reluctant to implement the security measures that chemical weapons threats required. Enhanced fuel testing, medical monitoring, and emergency response protocols were expensive and complicated, reducing profitability in an industry that operated on narrow margins. The divide became apparent when I tried to return to cross-border hauling after my recovery. Progressive companies offered enhanced security protocols, hazmat detection equipment, and comprehensive medical coverage for drivers accepting high-risk loads. Conservative companies offered nothing except assurances that the terrorists had been caught and the threat had been eliminated. But I knew the threat hadn't been eliminated. The organization that had poisoned my fuel was just one of many criminal enterprises operating along the Mexican border. The methods they had developed, contaminating fuel supplies with chemical weapons, could be copied by other groups with similar objectives. My own security procedures evolved to address the specific vulnerabilities that the poisoning had revealed. Every fuel stop required chemical testing with portable detection equipment that could identify mercury compounds, organophosphates, and other toxic substances that might be used to contaminate diesel fuel. The testing process added time and expense to every run, but it was the only way to ensure that my fuel tanks didn't contain death instead of diesel. Other drivers initially viewed my precautions as paranoid overreaction, but several subsequent poisoning incidents convinced them that chemical testing was a necessary survival skill. The informal network of security-conscious truckers gradually expanded as more drivers recognized that cross-border hauling required military-style vigilance and preparation. We developed our own communication protocols, shared intelligence about suspected threats, and coordinated response procedures when attacks occurred. But we also discovered that criminal organizations were adapting their methods to counter our security measures. New chemical compounds were being developed that were undetectable by standard testing equipment. Contamination methods were becoming more sophisticated and harder to trace. The cat-and-mouse game between truckers and terrorists was escalating in complexity and lethality. The psychological toll of constant vigilance was enormous. Every fuel stop became a potential murder scene where death might be waiting in the diesel pumps. Every subtle change in engine performance triggered anxiety attacks, as I wondered whether I was experiencing mechanical problems or the early stages of another poisoning attempt. But the vigilance also provided a sense of purpose and control that helped me cope with the trauma of having been targeted for assassination. Instead of being a helpless victim, I became an active participant in economic warfare defense, using my experience to protect other drivers from similar attacks. The fuel that had been poisoned at the border was supposed to be my death sentence. Instead, it became the foundation for a new career in counterterrorism and transportation security that gave my life meaning beyond anything I'd experienced as a simple freight hauler. 5 years after the original poisoning, I received a call from Agent Santos informing me that intelligence sources had identified a new chemical weapons plot against cross-border truckers. This time the target was hydraulic brake fluid rather than diesel fuel, but the methodology and objectives were similar to the original attack. "We need your expertise," she said. "You understand how these people think, how they operate, and what vulnerabilities they exploit. Without your help, we might not be able to stop them before they kill dozens of drivers." The request was both flattering and terrifying. Flattering because it recognized that my survival and recovery had produced valuable intelligence that could save other lives. Terrifying because it meant that the war against transportation terrorism was ongoing, with new threats emerging as fast as old ones were neutralized. But I accepted the assignment without hesitation. The truckers who would become targets of the brake fluid poisoning plot deserved the same chance at survival that I'd had. They deserved to know that someone was watching for threats, developing countermeasures, and willing to fight back against people who viewed chemical weapons attacks as acceptable business tactics. The investigation lasted 8 months and resulted in arrests that prevented what federal prosecutors described as the largest domestic terrorism plot in Texas history. Over 200 truck drivers would have been killed or permanently disabled if the brake fluid contamination had been successful. But the investigation also revealed that the threat was evolving faster than our defensive capabilities. New criminal organizations were entering the economic warfare business, developing more sophisticated chemical weapons and targeting broader segments of the transportation industry. The war would continue, with new battles being fought at every truck stop, every border crossing, and every mile of highway where freight moved between nations. The weapons would become more subtle, more deadly, and harder to detect. The stakes would increase as terrorists realized that disrupting transportation networks could cripple entire economies. But the war could also be won by ordinary truckers who understood the threats and implemented appropriate countermeasures. Every driver who learned chemical testing procedures, every company that enhanced security protocols, and every law enforcement agency that took transportation terrorism seriously was contributing to a defensive network that made attacks more difficult and expensive. My fuel had been poisoned at the border with one of the most toxic substances known to science, but I had survived to help build that defensive network. The mercury that was supposed to kill me had instead created expertise that protected hundreds of other drivers from similar attacks. The highways of Texas still call to me, despite everything that happened on that September night when I discovered that death could be measured in gallons and mixed with the very substance that powered my truck. The road remains essential for American commerce, security, and the integrated economic relationships that connect nations. But I never drive those highways without remembering that predators can be patient, sophisticated, and virtually undetectable until their chemical weapons have already begun their deadly work. The fuel contamination taught me that terrorism can be as subtle as a change in engine performance and as lethal as mercury vapor seeping into a truck cab. Since that night, every gallon of diesel gets tested, every fuel stop gets evaluated for security threats, and every driver gets warned about the possibility that their next fill-up might contain poison instead of petroleum. The vigilance is exhausting and expensive, but it's also the only thing standing between the trucking industry and people who view chemical weapons attacks on civilian infrastructure as legitimate tools of economic warfare. The border regions of Texas remain hunting grounds for terrorists who understand that fuel contamination can be more effective than bombs, more subtle than bullets, and virtually undetectable until the poison has had time to complete its work. But those same regions also contain a network of drivers who understand the threats, implement effective countermeasures, and refuse to be terrorized by people who mistake civilian truckers for defenseless targets. The war continues every day on every highway, at every fuel stop where death might be waiting in the diesel tanks. But the war can be won by ordinary truckers who understand that survival requires extraordinary vigilance and the willingness to fight back with everything they have. My fuel was poisoned at the border, but I survived to help other drivers recognize and defeat similar attacks. That may be the most important cargo I've ever hauled across the highways of Texas. the knowledge that chemical weapons terrorism can be stopped by truckers who refuse to become victims.